Lesson 13.6. What were the impacts of both the Great Depression and the Second World War on Canadian society? We'll learn about those two things as well as a few other elements as well in today's lesson. So stick around and let's learn something. There's good times and there's bad times. Welcome to lesson 13.6. What were the impacts of the Great Depression and the Second World War on Canadian society? The 1920s, they were prosperous for Canadians, for many Canadians anyways. That was after the First World War. Prosperous times. But in the 1930s, there was a worldwide plunge into something called the Great Depression. The Great Depression was when the economy worldwide came to a grinding halt. Factories closed, workers lost their jobs, and people lost their entire life savings. Many people left their farms with no income to move to the cities to look for work. Work in the cities was almost non-existent. The unemployment rate was so high, nobody could find jobs. Western Canada got a double hit because not only were they dealing with the Great Depression, but Western Canada also saw a terrible drought, and therefore incomes of farmers began to decline, and many farmers lost their entire farms. During the Depression, actually, more people left the prairie provinces than were arriving into those prairie provinces. So it was a very difficult time for families living in Western Canada. The First Nations that were living here in Western Canada, they were also suffering during the Great Depression, and many turned to hunting and trapping and selling goods to tourists. So they were taking their products and they were selling them to tourists. And a change was trying to come about, and the government was trying to make a change and trying to get people to work. But by 1933, 25%, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. That is a tremendous amount of people not having jobs. So the government decided to make some work camps, and they made work camps for unmarried, unemployed men to go and work. Great idea, but the labor was so difficult. They went and they cleared roads, they cut firewood, and they were making 20 cents a day. That's not a lot of money for back then. Even though it was way back then, that's not a lot of money. That's almost nothing. In 1935, we see a strike in Vancouver, and the people that were on strike, they boarded rail cars for the On to Ottawa trek to meet the Prime Minister for a face-to-face meeting with him to discuss what we can do to help these people that are out of work. And as the train was moving east towards Ottawa, more and more people got on this train. And you can see an image here of people just boarding this train as it's making its way to Ottawa. Well, word quickly spread, and the RCMP, the police, stopped this train in Regina. There is a commotion that happens, and one person ends up dead, and many people are injured. And the Great Depression is in full swing by 1935, and people are laying blame to wherever they can, and they're pointing fingers to whoever they can. And they were pointing fingers, I should say, at these old political parties, because these old political parties, according to the people of the time, were not helping the people. So new parties began to emerge, and some of these parties' names you might be familiar with. The Social Credit Forums, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which later gets named the New Democratic Party, the NDP, emerges. And these new parties argued that government should have social programs in place to help people. We need to have They're saying employment insurance. There should be workers' compensation. And the public ownership of key industries is vital to a strong Canadian economy. And the social services in Canada that are in existence are the old age pension, which came about in 1927. And this gave the elderly, our seniors, an income. Employment insurance came out of this. This came after the Great Depression. And it gave short-term income to workers who lost their jobs so that they can continue to pay bills and feed their families. A family allowance was later introduced after the Great Depression, and this gives a small amount of money to families who have children. And this gentleman right here, the picture here, this is Tommy Douglas, and another Canadian social program, a social service in Canada, is public health care. And this was the idea of this man here, Tommy Douglas, who was part of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in 1947, and he was the kind of the key player in Canada getting publicly funded health care. The Great Depression lasts for many, many years until 1939 at the outbreak and the beginning of the Second World War. Always seems that war produces and kickstarts an economy. The army gave jobs to anyone who wanted a job. You want to come and fight? You want to fight the Germans? Let's go fight the Germans. You're hired. No experience necessary. The factories that were making consumer goods, they turned back, like in the First World War, to creating tools of war. And this war all began when Nazi Germany invaded its neighbors. And we got the Axis and we got the Allies who are fighting with each other. The Axis nations are made up of Germany, Italy, and Japan. You will be learning more about Japan in future grades of social studies. But those three nations made up the Axis powers. The Allies comprised of the British Empire, France, China, the Soviet Union, the United States, and now we're seeing Canada as a nation enter into this war. Whereas in World War I, they entered as part of the British Empire, and now in the Second World War, they're entering as their own country. And Canada did send soldiers, and they sent lots of soldiers. Our soldiers went into Western Europe, they went into Italy, and they went into parts of Asia, and they fought the war on multiple fronts. And it wasn't until 1945 that the Second World War ends. And it ends, and we'll, like I said, you'll learn this in future courses of social studies and future grades, but it ends after the United States drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, completely obliterating those 2 cities. In total, at the end of the war, 75 million, that's not a typo, 75 million people are dead. 40 million of them are citizens, so ordinary people like you and me. And from a Canadian standpoint, more than 1 million Canadians joined the army, during World War II. That's an incredible number of Canadians joining the army. Over 42,000 of those million died, and over 54,000 came back wounded. But war always leads to some sort of economic boom, and the Second World War was no different. There was post-war prosperity that existed in Canada because of the Second World War, and that economic prosperity, which was kick-started by World War II, continued well after the war. Oil, gas, and coal were in heavy demand worldwide, and Canada was able to supply oil, gas, and coal to those areas that demanded it. The factories who paused to create war goods, went back to producing consumer goods. And then we see a baby boom after the war, known as the baby boomer generation. You may have heard the OK boomer before. Well, that comes from the baby boomer generation. And the school enrollment between 1945 and 1961 doubled in enrollment, which meant we needed more schools, we needed more hospitals, we needed more services for this growing population, this rapidly growing population of Canada. All right, I want you to head over to your notebooks and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.